Hello, welcome to my podcast signature assignment submission for the anthropology course that I'm taking. Let's just get started. Throughout our history, many cultures and societies have been lost due to the brutality of war. I believe that utilizing anthropologists in times of war could help secure important cultural and historical artifacts of societies in that region. Specifically, I believe that cultural anthropologists could have helped ease the transition and mitigate the brutality of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 was an unjust response to terrorist acts because of the lack of real information, in my opinion. Without true evidence of, quote, weapons of war that the terrorist organization supposedly had, using practices of cultural anthropology beforehand, could have actually helped give the United States factual information and be able to make informed decisions on how to fight terrorism. With the aid of cultural anthropologists, if sent before the official invasion, they'd be able to help identify and assess what cultural and historical artifacts that could have been kept to preserve the indigenous population's history instead of letting thieves and looters destroy thousands of years worth of history all within days of this invasion. I also believe that even during the invasion, cultural anthropologists using the technique of immersion would be able to have a peaceful relationships with the civilian population of Iraq and could have helped deviate from the U.S. troops decimating and destroying certain aspects of the Iraq civilian population. These troops were meant to liberate these civilians, and due to the language and cultural differences, the ability to truly communicate with the local population was close to none. So this led to unwarranted and horrendous attacks and the destruction of the civilian population of Iraq, and I'll go into a little bit how I think cultural anthropologists could have helped mitigate that. We know that the decision to invade Iraq was not made with much contemplation. In fact, it was a decision made with insufficient evidence to justify the act. In a documentary that I found, it's called Truth and War and Consequences, produced by Frontline PBS on YouTube. This talks about the lack of evidence prior to the attack on 9/11 to actually invade Iraq, and even after not having concrete enough evidence to justify a war. Within a week after 9/11, the Bush administration made a top priority to try and find enough evidence against Saddam Hussein to try and tie the Taliban to the attack on 9/11, hopefully giving justification for that invasion. There were people sent in to investigate in this documentary the evidence for the war on terrorism. What they found were organizations that would not share information, mainly like the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, was not giving up any information to outside sources. It was said in this documentary that the accuracy of the evidence it was said in the documentary that the accuracy of the evidence found was not true, that the intelligence agencies forced their way into interpreting their data to make their evidence seem justified. This is what we would call confirmation bias. With lack of true information coming from the CIA, it makes it impossible to know the true validity of the information that they were portraying. I believe that if cultural anthropologists were sent into Iraq before all-out war, these scientists would have been able to connect with the local population and indigenous people. They would have been able to understand their culture from a perspective that most people in the U.S. would never get, and to be able to provide factual evidence for the United States before invading a country based on suspicions. Cultural anthropologists, when dealing with local populations, they might create some biases, but if they're able to practice good participation observation, they're able to interact with the local population, but they're still able to gather enough quantitative data and send that back to the United States so that the United States could make an invasion based off of informed decisions and make factual based decisions, not just suspicious hunch. I believe that with the evidence provided by cultural anthropologists, they would have been able to point out maybe even a lack of evidence for Saddam Hussein having these, quote, weapons of war, and maybe they would have been able to cause, with a lack of evidence, there would have been, less of an invasion, and so inherently causing less bloodshed with an invasion based on factual information. The difference between immersion and participation observation is when you're practicing immersion, you're actually living that specific culture's way of life in order to get that true representation of what their life is like. Whereas participation observation, you can interact with the population, but you do not need to be as closely tied with their culture. Now, I think that cultural anthropologists using the practice of immersion would have been able to learn the culture in a way to help identify important cultural and historical artifacts. A lot of culture was lost in this invasion of Iraq. There was lots of looting, lots of thieving going on. So cultural anthropologists, if they're practicing immersion, they would have been able to connect and understand what historical items, what religious artifacts are important to the people at the time, and hopefully they'd be able to set up a plan in place where they can, relate to the United States. Okay, these artifacts show the true thousands years worth of history, and if we don't get them to a safe, secure location, we could lose that. And they'd be able to point out really the history that was lost. There's a website I found called the MiddleEastEye.net, and it has an article that talks about when Baghdad fell, the country's treasures were lost. They weren't talking about gold or money, but artifacts and pieces of history that hold significant sentimental value and historical value. It talks about how after 36 hours after the initial invasion, thieves ransacked an institution which was founded in 1923 dedicated to preserving this historical and cultural heritage. And within 36 hours, more than half of the artifacts were lost, destroyed, gone forever. And so I believe that cultural anthropologists would have been able to help go down, identify what is important to these people religiously, historically, bring it to a different country, help secure it, maybe bring in security forces to help guard that historical importance, because now it is just lost and destroyed. And the last big thing that I think cultural anthropologists would have been able to do is create that connection between us as an American people and the actual Iraq civilization. We didn't have very much direct communication. We didn't know how they actually lived. And there ended up being a lot of atrocities because of it, and a lot of terrible things that happened because we did not have proper communication, and we weren't treating them like they were on the same playing field as us. So cultural anthropologists really could have been able to help us have a real perspective on how they live and why they make certain decisions and why they have different, cultural hierarchies, that kind of thing. There's an article published by Harvard Law, and it sheds light on the true natures of how civilians were treated in this invasion. It says, first, documentation can make a difference. In 2002, I was part of a human rights watch team that reported on civilian casualties caused by the U.S. air campaign in Afghanistan from October 2001 to March 2002. So they were actually in the Middle East before even 2003. We found that the U.S. Air Forces used cluster munitions in or near town that killed villages and injured over more than 100 civilians. I think it's crazy. The second thing it finds is second, fact-finding requires careful digging, not quick judgment. For example, we wondered about the pattern of failed U.S. airstrikes on Iraqi leaders. The bombs used were precision-guided munitions, but they did not kill any of the intended targets and caused dozens of civilian casualties instead. These bombs determined the location of the targets based on a satellite phone intercept, and they were only accurate within 100 meters. So basically, anybody within that 100 meters could have been killed as well. They found that March 23rd and through April 11th, the U.S. Air Force had targeted 50 Iraqi leaders, but it killed 0 and killed many civilians. That just shows the importance of that information that they could have had, being able to warn the civilian population of maybe where these bombs are hitting, and helping them in that way, as well as maybe actually learning where these terrorists or Iraqi leaders really were, and created specific precision attacks. And with that said, anthropology has many different subfields, many which could be pertinent to help solving the world's problems. I believe that the use of cultural anthropologists would have made the invasion of Iraq in 2003 look very different. I believe that if cultural anthropologists were sent down before the invasion, they could have been able to provide credible and accurate information of quantitative data from the local population that could have been relayed to the United States government, this giving the United States government specific locations of the known terrorist organizations instead of attacking the civilian population. This either gives the U.S. true reason for invasion or to acknowledge the lack of evidence to support this invasion. Cultural anthropologists could have helped mitigate the culture and historical loss this war had on Iraq, losing thousands of years worth of heritage and history of their population. Cultural anthropologists would have been able to go in and preserve these historical artifacts and have more of a full knowledge of that indigenous population's history. I believe that before starting war, there must be an accurate communication line to that civilian life as to not harm the non-combatant civilian population. Cultural anthropologists could have been that direct line of communication to the local population in order to show the American troops how to properly communicate with the local tribes and population, this helping the United States troops cause less atrocities over mere misunderstanding. Cultural anthropologists could have shown the importance of diverse societies in Iraq and predicted the actual toll of the violence happening at the time. They would have been able to actually report the brutality, death, and destruction of civilian life faced in 2003. And destruction that the civilian life did face in 2003. I believe that the use of cultural anthropologists could have changed the perspective of the American people on Iraq life, as well as encouraging empathy. I believe that with the accurate data and information they could have mitigated, the true terror that was brought with the invasion of Iraq in 2003 to the local civilian population could have been mitigated and could have been lessened. And with that said, I thank you very much.